Welcome back, everyone. Before we get into today's topic, things have been a little challenging with the statement drafts and peer review comments. So this is really the big deal in this course as far as assigned work. Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't realize until even today just how many of these statement drafts did not have the proper permissions enabled to allow people to look at them. And in most of those cases, nobody told me in terms of reviewers. Either they hadn't even looked until today or late last night or whatever, or they just didn't say anything. So I don't know. I didn't think the instructions were too complicated, but I think I'll have to try something else next time around. You know, I mean, the points for this stuff does depend partly on getting it done on time. It's especially important for the peer review comments because, you know, obviously if somebody doesn't have peer comments, then they're not in as good a position to revise their draft for next Friday when that's due. You know, I should emphasize too that there are a few people in this class that have earlier application deadlines that would really benefit from being able to work ahead. You know, if you haven't submitted all your peer comments yet, please make sure to do so as soon as possible. They're due now. But if you don't have them done, please make that your top priority. All right. Any questions related to the statement, draft, or peer feedback? So the other thing I should emphasize is don't make any of the comments on your document disappear yet. I know I mentioned that last time. I know at least in one case it happened anyway. But I just want to emphasize that again. So please do not accept or otherwise delete any of the comments in your draft until I relay to you all that I have been able to go through them. So for now, I need to be able to look at those you know, to assign proper credit to your peer reviewers. All right. Okay, so today we are going to have a special behind the scenes look at the admissions process. And so we're actually, in this regard, kind of transitioning out from talking about the application. So we're kind of exiting really this second and probably largest unit of the course where we've been really focusing on the application itself. We'll still cover that in part today because I'll be talking about how we review applications. But then we'll also be kind of transitioning forward and talking about what happens after we get applications, including looking ahead toward the interview process, which we will cover in greater detail next week. So last time was our last session that was really dedicated entirely to the application. And we talked about diversity in admissions, being motivated by the relative lack of diversity in US science. And we talked about how diversity is considered in multifaceted ways by admissions committees, and especially after the recent court decision, there is a prohibition on actually considering race itself no matter what sort of imbalances may exist in a field. And instead, any consideration of race-related experiences or factors has to be individualized in terms of an individual's ability to contribute to that university and program. And we talked about statements as well. We talked about how different schools are asking for different things with regard to statements. Some of them are, some of them, like our program, have kind of a traditional statement that includes both personal motivation and research experiences and interests. And then a separate added statement that is kind of a diversity focused prompt. In other cases, you might just have one statement that includes diversity or doesn't. Or you could have, the three separate things asked for separately. So, you have to kind of recombine your statement material in different ways, in addition to tailoring it based on the specific program and the faculty affiliated with it. This is just kind of tying diversity into what you need overall in terms of the written material for your applications. So today we are going to have a peek into the admissions process. And I'm going to go through in a fair bit of detail what we actually do on our admissions committee. So this is really entirely going to be about what our admissions committee does. I don't know in this level of detail what anybody else does, really. But I can give you as detailed and clear a sense as I can of what happens when we get our applications. With the hope that the more you understand about the admissions process itself and what we're looking for, the better you will be able to prepare your application materials accordingly. And some of this will seem a bit familiar, especially in terms of what we're looking for in the application. Some of this will seem familiar, like in terms of what to put in your personal statements. But you'll get to see directly the advice that I give to our application reviewers. And then we will talk about what happens after application review in terms of inviting applicants to interview and ultimately accepting many of them. I'll kind of mix in this perspective today as well, just like what's happening in terms of our overall applicant pool numerically. So I'll actually come back to that a little bit right away here. For perspective, our own fairly modest sized graduate program got 172 applications last year. And from my perspective, that's both wonderful because it means there's a lot of interest in the program, but also challenging because it means we have to review 172 applications as a committee. And what our committee is largely this group of 10 people, 6 of whom are faculty, including me, and then 4 of our current PhD students, I think I've mentioned this before, are serving on the admissions committee in any given year. So we have 10 people who can review applications, and that helps, but there's still a multiplier on whatever you want to do with these 172. We definitely cannot have the entire committee review every application. We can't have everyone actually, thoroughly read through 172 applications. That would be crazy. Nobody has enough time, really. We have to do kind of a tiered system for sorting through these. You know, and the other relevant point of context here is that our goal is actually to winnow this group down to you know, a relatively modest fraction that we want to accept. You know, so last year we accepted 28 out of the 172. So, you know, in that regard, you know, we kind of want to put more of our attention on the more competitive group of applicants within this 172. And we don't really need to so much work out for ourselves, like, you know, how do they all sort out within the bottom half? That's kind of irrelevant for our consideration. So what we do is to implement this multi-stage application review. And this is something that I came up with when our number of applicants started rising kind of quickly. And we really just couldn't keep doing what we had been doing in terms of the time that our committee members had available. We couldn't have like, you know, we couldn't have like a whole set of like, let's say 5 reviewers review every application because the numbers just get too high. And so I implemented what felt like kind of a bold strategy here. And I really had to like go back through our previous admissions data and convince myself that I wasn't gonna, you know, that we weren't gonna miss good candidates by doing this. But I did it, and you know, I did that, and it was borne out. So what we do is in this first round of application review, each application is actually only being read by 2 people on our committee. And they, you know, on the basis of, you know, things I'll elaborate in a little bit here, they actually assign a numeric score to each application. And that for our scale, that's from 1 at the best to 7 at the worst. And I encourage them to have kind of a uniform distribution among the ones that they review, at least in kind of the first round where you should get the full spectrum. And so, you know, that may seem, you know, kind of adventurous to only have 2 people doing that, but I put in some kind of safeguards here. So if either the average score exceeds, you know, some moderately good level, or either of the reviewers thought that they were especially good, they will advance to the next round. So one bad review can't tank anybody. And the other thing that I do is that for anyone who was, you know, like close to the line in this particular round, I actually go and kind of, you know, I make myself like a third reviewer and help decide whether to send a few extra along into the next round. By doing this, though, we actually managed to eliminate something like 60% of the applications that are just not going to be in that smallish fraction that I told you about a minute ago. And so we're advancing then about 40% onto the next rounds. And at this point, that is true both on the domestic side and on the international side. And then for those, for just the ones that advanced onward, they go to basically another 2 faculty and another 1 student, becoming 3 and 2 total. So they're now going to have 5 reviewers. And then we'll sort these by average score, just as kind of an organizational thing for our admissions meeting. And then we will discuss them. In some cases, after this admissions meeting, if there's a few we can't decide on, then we'll actually send them to the rest of the committee. But we try to keep that to a minimum. Usually we're able to make the decisions we need to based on the 5 reviews obtained and what people can say based on reading them. So then we get to the point where the whole admissions committee is meeting. By the way, we actually do this on a very adventurous timetable. You know, we're really kind of pushing our committee to get through these in the first half of December, and to be actually making our interview invitations before Christmas. Not every program does that, but we do, and that's partly because our interviews are also really early, as I'll come back to. So now the admissions committee meets, and this is done in a democratic manner. So the 10 members who reviewed applications, in addition to our graduate program manager, can all vote on any given interview invitation decision. And it doesn't, my vote counts the same as a student member or anyone else. So that's how we basically decide who we're going to invite. And so, we've got like 172 applications, or maybe we're talking about just the domestic ones in this meeting, and then we'll come back to the international ones, for example, but still big numbers. We had 101 just on the domestic side. So we can't actually talk about all of them during any meeting, even if it's a 3-hour meeting. That just doesn't work. And so usually what I do is, having sorted the applications based on their average score, I basically choose 2 lines to draw. And the top line, maybe this is just like, if we're talking about the domestic ones, maybe we're talking about like the top 12 or 15 or so. And then I asked the committee, is there anybody above this line that you have any reservation about inviting to interview? And if yes, then we'll pull them out and talk about them later. And then barring that, I say, okay, let's have a vote to batch invite this group of top ranked applicants. That vote is always unanimous. And then we don't have to talk about them all individually. And then the other line that I draw, I asked the committee, all right, is there anyone below this line that you would like to talk about individually and still consider inviting them to interview? And often there's at least 2 or 3 recommendations. Maybe someone really liked this applicant, even though their average score wasn't that good. And maybe they saw something that others didn't, or maybe others saw something that they didn't. We'll find out. We'll talk about them individually. And then we do, kind of the reciprocal vote to basically decline everyone below this line as a group. And that vote is always unanimous as well. And then what we have left are predominantly the names between those 2 lines, and also anyone who is pulled out from the top group or the bottom group. And those are the ones that we will discuss one by one. And the way that we actually do this is that, and I started doing this during the pandemic when we had to do these meetings online. I asked one person to summarize the strengths of this applicant, somebody who gave them a good score. And I asked another person to summarize the weaknesses of this applicant, someone who gave them a not so good score. Then I invite others to share further things that they noticed in each regard. And after we've heard that balance of conversation, then the entire committee votes on whether we want to invite that applicant. So that's basically how it works. Yeah, I talked about this and without flashing it up here, but yeah, so we go through these steps. I draw these 2 lines. We talk about the middle scoring group individually. And then we make these decisions, but these decisions are not like, they're not just individual decisions. They're decisions that we have to make in the context of how many applicants we want to interview. And that depends on how many students we're hoping to actually recruit. I'll say more about this in a little while. But based on how many we hope to recruit, then I know about how many I think we need to accept, assuming they meet our standards. And based on how many we would hope to accept, then I know about how many I would like to interview. And we'd rather not go way above that target in terms of how many we interview, because it takes time and energy to do these interviews, and especially the faculty that we're asking to meet with the interviewees have somewhat limited bandwidth and availability to actually do that. And so it doesn't work out well, if we're gonna get too adventurous on how many we interview. And, so I'll come back to that, this whole numbers game. But this is just making the general point that, it is partly a property of the group of applicants, and how many interview slots we feel like we really can accommodate. So now I'm going to get into how we actually evaluate applications and the advice that I give to our reviewers. And so I'm going to put up a bunch of little screen grabs here from the actual document that I provide to our first-time committee members. So this is just, this particular blurb is just the scoring system, 1 to 7. Try to make it a uniform distribution. Nothing too interesting here. So that's the basic idea. So how should they do that? Well, I let them know what my priorities are in terms of scoring applications, and I give a lot more detail on each of these points, and I kind of show them how I'm actually, how my notation system looks. We'll get to that too. But I also invite pluralism from our committee members in terms of their own beliefs about, what is going to make a successful graduate student and what should we prioritize, how highly. And so, I say, well, here are my particular priorities, but yours can be different. And so, this may only be the roughest guide in terms of more general priorities among people on admissions committees wherever. But we'll go through each of these factors in turn. So I don't give people a really rigid framework for how they need to evaluate applications. I give them a lot of suggestions. But ultimately it is up to individual committee members, and they're not going to all have the same priorities, and I think that's a good thing. So you've already heard a lot from me about what I'm looking for in personal statements. And so especially you've seen these 6 bullet points at least twice already for what to put into the statement. And you've obviously put together your own draft statement at this point as well. But among the other things that I specifically mentioned to our committee members, is to suggest that if a student can't express why PhD research in genetics is right for them, then maybe it's not. That is kind of the risk we run if we're not making that a priority. I think I also highlighted this when we talked about the statement, is just, I do care about the writing itself. I care about whether it is organized in a clear and logical way, and whether the writing itself is easy for me to parse, and get meaning out of. I encourage our committee members to consider the same question that I highlighted a few weeks ago. Would you want to write a paper with them? Because that's a very realistic consideration, especially for the faculty on the committee. Faculty are going to need to write papers with the students. The students are going to have to write drafts of research papers, and they that's going to require, attention from the faculty, maybe a moderate amount of attention, maybe an excessive amount of attention, depending on where we're starting with that draft. And so, this is a very relevant factor in terms of performance in a PhD program. Again, we've already gone through these questions multiple times, ranging from personal motivation to, how are you sure that research is right for you, and your past research experience, your forward-looking interest, why this program and why specific faculty within it. We do obviously hope to get a sense of an applicant's research interests. Sometimes I don't, but usually I do. We consider whether our program is the right fit for them. And so this might be somewhat different from university to university, but at UW specifically, applicants have the option to apply for up to 3 programs, for the same application fee. And, in some cases, that's very reasonable. A student has interests that are kind of at the cusp of 2 different fields, that may help them out. They can also choose to upload a different statement to each program if they want. Although, it's clear that at least a few of them don't, because sometimes we might read a statement and conclude, well, based on what they've uploaded, based on the statement they've uploaded to UW Genetics specifically, it still kind of sounds like another program might fit their interest better than ours. Question, yes. Yes. Yes, I can see the other programs that they have applied to, just the list. So either there are 0 other programs or 1 or 2. And so that's all we see. And so, sometimes maybe, maybe it seems like they are better suited to this other program and they also applied to it. Sometimes it might seem like they're better suited to this other program and they didn't apply to it. But even there, if they're not a great fit for our program, they're not a great fit for our program. And that's still, it's kind of similar in either case. But I'm just saying this is one reason, I would say, why we get extra applications that are not well targeted to our program, is the fact that this is allowed freely. It's clear, that there are some applicants who just couldn't resist the prospect of having 2 more free chances to get into grad school, and didn't really want to put in the time to tailor things a whole lot to those other programs. And I could complain about the extra work that puts on us as an admissions committee, but actually the university just decided to change this next year and then decided not to. So the university is a bit conflicted about it as well. But this is the policy, and apparently will continue to be. But we are a little bit wary, both, because we want students that, that do fit our program, and, and are not going to come here and then say, well, it's great that you have these 85 faculty affiliated with your genetics program, but I'm actually really interested in these other faculty, because that happens. Even as many faculty as we have affiliated with our program. We'd rather not have that happen. And the other thing is, it's clear that even when we are kind of, drawn to consider this amazing looking applicant that, okay, maybe, might fit slightly better in another program, very often they're going to decline our interview anyway, because they're going to largely get the interviews they wanted, and they're going to pick the ones that fit them better. And we know that, and we don't want to waste our time. And so, this university has a lot of graduate programs in the life sciences. And so we don't mind at all if applicants have interests that really straddle pretty evenly the boundary between two fields. We're happy to give them full consideration on both sides of that. But if it really seems like another program is the better fit, then that becomes a minus in terms of our consideration. And it better fit largely in terms of what they have told us, not even so much in terms of their background. It's not like we're saying like, well, they were a microbiology major as an undergrad. We don't mind that. We take students like that. But if from what they're telling us, it still doesn't seem like genetics is at least an equally good fit for them, and which definitely happens, then that's what we're more concerned about. And again, I mean what they're telling us specifically, since they are free to upload statements that are as different as they like between different programs at UW with the same application fee. So this is what I am telling our reviewers about reviewing personal statements. And I have a somewhat briefer section about reviewing recommendation letters, and acknowledging here that we do tend to put a lot more weight on letters from research advisors, because those are the ones who can really speak pretty directly to how has research gone for this applicant. And that's something we're pretty desperate to get insight into. There can be valuable things in other letters as well. We don't just skip them, but the advisor letters do get more weight. And we do expect that they will be there generally. So, it does, I think I mentioned this when we talked about recommendation letters. It does raise eyebrows a little bit when someone leaves out the letter from their advisor from a couple years ago and just sends in another instructor letter instead that might not have a ton to say. So that does kind of make us wonder, well, did that not go so well? So it's better to have even just an okay letter from an advisor generally than not to, unless it's someone who is like from 5 years ago or something. I've also mentioned the fact that we have these bubble scores. I showed you an example application where the recommender is asked to fill out all these little category scores, and also an overall score, which is which can be outstanding, and the vast majority of them are. I think it's partly just kind of the culture of recommendations in American academia. So the vast majority of our applicants are rated outstanding by their letter writers, but they could also choose strong or average, or there's one or two below those that we basically never see. The large majority are outstanding, and then the large majority of the rest are strong. And occasionally we might see average, and almost never anything below that. I'm trying to help our reviewers understand here that there's definitely an element of reviewer variation here, not just applicant variation in the bubble scores that are chosen. Some recommenders are just more kind of stringently minded than others, in terms of how they're going to fill out scores like that. It's something where individuals vary. And so that's why you have to read it. Sometimes a letter might just be marked strong, But I read that letter and, I think, oh, this is actually quite good. And then maybe I read another letter and it's marked outstanding, but I read it and there's really not a whole lot to recommend this person from the text of the letter. We can't necessarily judge a book by its cover here. We got to actually see what the people have to say about, these individual applicants. So that's what I have to tell them about recommendation letters. I mean, I could go on. I could probably expand more if I wanted about what we would like to see from especially research advisor recommendations, but I haven't done that at this point. So I also have a big block in here about diversity, partly clarifying the current situation. So we don't even view race beginning this year of each applicant. And yet, we want to have a graduate program that is diverse in many regards for all of the reasons that I previously mentioned. So how are we going to do that? Well, I mentioned we do have a diversity prompt in our supplemental application. Individuals may discuss relevant issues there, or their own perspectives and priorities. We might also see this in their personal statement itself, or elsewhere. We might see it in their recommendation letters or in things they mention on their CV. But some of the things we might be looking for are, again, in what ways have they overcome adversity, and how does it set them up for future success? What character traits does that imply? We can reflect, we can consider all different aspects of their background, even including race as it relates to evidence of things like resilience, courage, and leadership, based on how those traits would help them succeed here. And I made this, specific point in an earlier class, just that, I think it's fair to say that someone who has come farther to get to this point might be, let's say, to use a metaphor, if you're watching a marathon and, two runners are at the same place now, but one of them had to start a mile back, I might bet on that one being the faster runner and more likely to win this thing. That's another point that I make to our admissions committee members. And I also mentioned a couple other just kind of markers of potentially a less advantaged background. One is being a first-generation college student. There's lots of research, showing that on average entails additional challenges. And I have mentioned that first-generation college students are present in a fairly small proportion in our applicant pool. And then for domestic applicants, there are other questions that may indicate, coming from a less advantaged background, including having received a Pell Grant. And so in terms of having a diversity of backgrounds represented in our program, that could be, relevant to consider to some degree anyway. And I've also emphasized that, at least to me, international diversity matters a lot too. I'm not sure that this is, as universally valued as I would like it to be across graduate programs and universities. But I think there are very strong cases for trying to train PhD biologists from a wide range of national and cultural backgrounds, both for the novel perspectives that they may bring and also for the impact that they may have, either in their own country or by just bridging to that community from wherever they are. So this is what I tell our committee members about considering diversity as of this year. The next thing, kind of coming back to the research part, is just considering research experience. And so I showed you in an earlier class how our supplemental application actually asks applicants to quantify their research experience. How long were you in this lab doing research, and how many hours a week on average did you spend on that? So we have that information, and that helps us to consider the different applicants' research experience in a more uniform lens, rather than trying to pick it out from the different ways that they each present that information in their CV or otherwise. So this is a very helpful thing for us. And so, I point out that at the least we want to make sure that they've done research and it's gone well. Partly just, because we do not want to end up with students who change their mind and decide they don't really want to do research and then leave the program. Programs are actually judged harshly by the proportion of their students that leave without a degree. Even though sometimes there are totally valid reasons why students do that, programs are a bit risk averse in that regard. They don't want to take students who are going to come and then change their mind and leave. And so that's one reason for making sure, this student has really done research, ideally on a close to full-time basis, and still been happy with that, and it's had good outcomes. That's why this is such a big emphasis. And I'm personally kind of open-minded about whether applicants have had one more extended research experience versus having several experiences in different labs. It's nice if at least one of their experiences is not super short. But beyond that, I think there are good things for each. Sometimes I see committee members who seem to prefer one or the other. I think there are good things about either. I think there are good things about experiencing multiple labs. I think there are also good things about having a really deep research experience in one place, and maybe, being able to experience more of the whole scientific process there. So either can be totally fine from my perspective. And I point out that, when we're comparing applicants that are so different, in these different areas that we're considering, sometimes what we end up talking about at the end of these admissions committee meetings is whether to take student A, who has done a lot of research, maybe they've really piled up the what did I call it, FTRMEs, the full-time research month equivalents, and maybe their letters are decent, maybe their academic record is decent. But maybe we're choosing between that person, who's probably someone who's been out of undergrad for at least a few years, and someone else who may be coming right from their undergrad. And, maybe they have more of a baseline level of research experience. So maybe not nearly as much as the first student. But, maybe we see some particular potential with them. Whether it's from their recommendation letter, from their research advisor, or what they wrote in their statement, or their academic record, or whatever. So these are sometimes the decisions we end up having to make. And again, different people, value different things when we're making that kind of call. So that's not something where I'm telling them, choose A or choose B. I'm just pointing out that these are the trade-offs that we have to work out amongst ourselves. And I've emphasized that, research that they've done doesn't have to be right in our field. Having some kind of life science research experience is important to us, but it doesn't have to be in genetics. We're a genetics program, but really, any somewhat related research experience is pretty predictive of how research would go for them, in one of our labs as well, in my opinion. And so, that's kind of what we're looking for. We don't consider, very strongly the exact topic of the research. And similarly, like for research skills, it can be appealing if an applicant has already picked up some rather advanced research skills. But it's not like a baseline expectation. Most research skills people are going to pick up after they're a grad student. And that's totally understood. But, can be worth noting anyway as a smaller factor. I've also talked about, my view on publication record. Most of our applicants, even the ones we invite to interview, do not have first or co-first author publications. And other publications, in my opinion, are not very predictive of grad school performance. They're often more a matter of circumstance, than the individual applicant themselves. Sometimes I encounter other faculty that seem to put some weight on that, but I try to discourage it. So this is what I'm telling our committee members about evaluating research experience. And the last part, I am lumping in academics and test scores. Test scores is less of a thing these days. Academics, we do get transcripts from every applicant, at least an undergraduate transcript, and sometimes like a master's or other transcript as well, or multiple others. And so, this is somewhat interesting, but, you kind of have to, decide how much weight you want to put on it. I suppose on average, students who work harder might get better grades. And on average, students with some specific intellectual traits might get better grades, but there are exceptions, and research is not coursework, so ultimately what graduate programs want are people that are good at research, much more so than people who are good in coursework. So I think that discourages us from placing a really heavy weight on academic record. These are very different activities, and we want students who are not just really good at doing assigned work exactly the way they're supposed to. We want students who can figure out for themselves what they should be doing and what might come next in their research project and have the initiative to just go do it without being told to. So there's that difference in mindset, that I alluded to at the very beginning of the course. But, this is still often of some interest to committee members. It is a little bit challenging to consider because they come from all different institutions. And so it is a little bit difficult for us to consider, what does it mean that this student has a 4.0 at a college that we might not be at all familiar with? you know, versus like, you know, this other student who, you know, maybe had a lower GPA at, you know, what we might believe to be a more academically stringent institution. It's hard to make these comparisons. And the other factor that I mentioned here, I think I mentioned this before too, is that we actually do have to at least argue for why we want to admit a student whose GPA was below 3.0. We can admit such a student, and we have. But you know, we have to make an extra case to the graduate school for why we want to do that. You know, I also encourage people to consider, like, you know, what kind of courses did this student take? You know, all the students who are applying to our program, at least, okay, maybe like, you know, 95% of them have done some sort of biology program as an undergrad. And yet, you know, there can be strong differences in the types of courses they decided to take. You know, some students really kind of dig in, like on math courses or computer science courses. On average, those courses seem to give lower grades than biology courses. And so try to keep that in mind. So, you know, that's or, you know, even if it's in biology, you know, some students may have tackled, you know, a bunch of graduate level courses and others not. So, you know, you got to look beyond the numbers. So, I also, you know, I mentioned that students do come from a wide range of different schools, and that you know, we do need to try to consider that in terms of like the grades that they got. But at the same time, you know, like I encourage our committee members not to get too hung up on, like, you know, whether an applicant is coming from a certain type of institution. Because, you know, we've had good students come from pretty obscure undergraduate institutions. And in general, you know, I don't think that factor is super predictive of success in our graduate program. To some degree, yes. Yes. I mean, I think, you know, I think that kind of like a standard biology curriculum is going to be viewed the same way regardless. But just speaking for myself personally, you know, like, you know, like if one applicant, you know, took a very standard biology curriculum, and, you know, nothing really beyond that you wouldn't expect that they need to take, and another applicant, you know, took the standard biology curriculum, but they were taking, you know, like, you know, like third year calculus sorts of courses. And, you know, I mean, maybe there were some B's and C's in there from those courses specifically, but like maybe their biology courses were like all A's. You know, maybe that first applicant, you know, has the same GPA, but it's because their biology courses, you know, they got, you know, like mostly B's in. You know, we have to pay attention to that. So that's the sort of distinction that I'm talking about. Otherwise, you know, I don't think people are getting, you know, that micro about like the exact names of the courses. Yeah, so yeah, so let's see. Yeah, so I encourage people to be kind of open-minded about the institutions that people come from, you know, even if it might subtly influence how we're looking at a particular GPA, let's say. I also mentioned here that, you know, for our own program, there is at least a small disadvantage for current or recent UW undergrads. And again, that's partly based on the priorities of our funding agency. So the NIH that funds our training grant does not want to see a large number of UW undergrads on that training grant. And then views also kind of vary amongst faculty, for example, about just how advisable it is for students to stay at their undergrad institution for grad school. I try not to really worry too much about that. You know, that feels a little bit paternalistic to me. And, you know, I think that there are individuals who have valid reasons for wanting to stick around. And, you know, we may be a little more inclusive if we're open to that. So, you know, we do accept some UW undergrads into our program every year. And, you know, sometimes they choose to stay. And I'm quite fine with that. But yeah, so it, you know, it'll kind of vary from place to place, whether that is a factor. You know, like if we didn't have the training grant, then maybe I wouldn't care terribly much at all. You know, other programs don't have that consideration, and it may not matter. So like, you know, I mean, the people in this room are UW undergrads. And so in terms of UW grad programs, you know, some of them are funded by training grants and some of them are not. And so it varies from program to program to the extent that that's a consideration. I also say some things about test scores here. Long ago, we used to require the GRE, at least several years ago, and subject GRE was optional. We still allow scores for those tests if applicants want to send them, but fewer and fewer do as we go forward in time. Because fewer and fewer programs require them. And if none of the programs that you're applying to require them, then maybe you're not motivated to pay to take that test. And so other programs, I would say, might not even accept them at all. Even if you want to send them, they might say, no, we will not look at that. You know, this has really diminished in importance, but we still allow for it in case there is a reason why an applicant feels like that might help their case. The one that can be a little more important, and that is not important in your case, but for international students who have attended institutions that are not English-speaking institutions, they are required to take either the TOEFL or the IELTS test. And, you know, that is something that we do take seriously because, you know, if we take a student who is really not up to par in English, you know, then there could be problems on the research side and communicating with their mentor and understanding their project. There could be problems when they're potentially asked to serve as a teaching assistant if they cannot communicate with the undergrads. So this is a pretty big deal to us for that subset of international students specifically. But again, not a consideration for the people in this room. Because even if you are an international student, if you attended an English-speaking institution like UW-Madison, you do not need to send the TOEFL, and we would not expect it. And nobody does, basically. Nobody sends scores in that situation. And so, you know, again, this is more on the side of international applicants who did not attend an English-speaking institution. This is actually a glimpse of my own note-taking from looking at a set of applicants that I was assigned to review. And so you can see, obviously, I took out the names. I'm not going to do that. And you could see how I scored them. So you got this whole range between 1 and 7, where 1 is the best. And so, my system, involves for each of a bunch of different kind of areas. There's some kind of score driving areas, and then there are some that are more for my reference. Like I don't care what their interests are within genetics, as long as they're genetics oriented interests, and as long as they are clear. So the only bad thing is if they're unclear, or if they don't mention faculty, or maybe if they only mention one. So you could see that, I'm kind of up or down rating them somewhat based on their statement, based on their academic record, based on diversity considerations, although that tends to only be a positive for me, just the way that I do it. In terms of the amount of research experience they've had, the perceived quality and relevance of that research experience, like what were they actually doing? Were they really like leading a research project? And how good were their research letters? And these are not necessarily all equal factors to me, as I've suggested already. But you could certainly see the trend that the ones that got really good scores, there's a lot of pluses up here, and that's less the case down here. And so these especially up here, you have a lot of applicants who I was impressed with their statement, and they've done a lot of high quality research. You see those signs especially. And so, sometimes, you could see little, at least bits of my comments, why I might not have liked perhaps their statement so much. Like you don't want to see in my comments zero research detail, or just limited content period, as my summary of their statement of purpose. But that does happen. People have different, I guess, beliefs about what it takes to get into grad school. But you also see down here, cases where either there's very little research experience. I actually converted these into my FTRMEs, or concern about the role that they played, that they didn't really have a project that they were, or kind of a sub project that they were taking some level of ownership for, or maybe the letters were not as strong as we were looking for. So that sort of thing. So, these are the sorts of notes that I have made, and that give me reference points when we go to discuss these applicants in our admissions committee meetings. Things, that help me remember, why was I more positive or less positive about a given applicant. So you could see, I make a lot of notes about the statement, sometimes a lot of notes about the recommendation letters. I don't need to say a lot about FTRMEs, that's kind of is what it is. And sometimes I have other little notes that I've made about, diversity, adversity, course notes, notes about their specific research. So, this is kind of like the information that I'm giving myself to look back on later. And I also pay attention here to whether they've applied to other programs here. That doesn't mean I won't like them. Like, one of my top ranked people here applied to 2 other programs, and I was cool with that. But it can be a useful bit of context depending on how the conversation turns in our admissions meeting. And anything else that just didn't fit in these bins, like, they're one of the rare ones that had a first author manuscript. Maybe surprisingly, that didn't really sway me too much on those candidates specifically. They must have had other things I was less wild about. Yeah, so that's basically what I'm giving myself to look back on. And the other thing that this really helps me with is just being consistent, like I have to review dozens of applications. Do I still remember, like how good was this other one that I gave a 2.5 to? this helps me to compare the new one that I'm scoring against the ones that I already looked at in a fair way. Question, yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I'm trying to, bake in my total impressions into my score. And so I wouldn't really be able to tell you like, I want this, person with a 4 over that person with a 4. So but sometimes there can be a case, I feel like when we're trying to decide, like based on applications, who we want to interview, if something was, if for one applicant, everything in their application is totally clear, we're just kind of lukewarm on them as a result. For another applicant, there are some things about their application that are quite tantalizing, and others that we're really unsure about, but we feel like we might actually be able to clarify those things if we interviewed them. That might be a reason to interview, the latter candidate, even, given having, the same score, let's say, or the same average score among reviewers. That's really about all I could say. There's not much more to it than that, except, sorting out everyone's priorities and, trying to make the best collective decision that we can. Yeah. Tell you if you have a plus or plus or I will I'll make some effort. I'm gonna do more in terms of feedback on the statements than I'm doing for the other little assignments on the way. Most of the assignments on the way here, I just want to make sure that that you put appropriate thought into it. But the statement, I'm really going to provide detailed feedback, mostly just geared toward, helping you improve it to the greatest extent that I can. But I don't know, like show of hands, like how many of you would want me to tell you just like where your statement stacks up? Yeah? Okay. I will keep that in mind. All right. Okay, so this was really the biggest chunk of today, but I'd like to, in this last bit, say a little bit about what happens next. After we review these applications, one qualifier I want to make here, because I'm going to parse things out by US and international applicants, is that for our program, it does matter. Even though I think on average, our international applicants are just as good as our domestic applicants, we have this factor where, a big driver in terms of how many students we can admit is our NIH training grant. And we're only allowed to use that money to fund US applicants. And so we just don't have much money to our name that we are allowed to spend on the rotations of international students. I want to figure out how we could get more, but we're not in the best situation in that regard right now. So on the US side, we had 101 applications. Again, 40% or so make it past that first aggressive cutoff in our multi-stage review system. Out of those, we actually ended up inviting a good majority of them to interview, but that's about a third of the original total. On the international side, we passed about the same proportion past the first round, again, reflecting their similar overall quality in our eyes. We only invited a very small number of them for program interview because of our extremely limited funds to actually provide for rotations that we give to program admitted applicants. But remember, we also have this direct admit track in our program. And so another 17 of these applications were cleared for at least consideration for direct admission. So they would still need to be interviewed, but their application was considered, to be good enough to consider for direct admission. And, that happened in some cases. Some of them, like specific faculty were interested in interviewing them, either because they contacted the faculty or the faculty contacted them. Either one can happen. two from this group are part of our first year class this year. So, you know, it's not like these are the only international applicants who ended up having the chance to come here. It's just a matter of the program versus direct admission routes. So, you know, that's kind of how things broke down post application review. Yeah, question. Mm-hmm. Well, only the admissions committee members decide who is eligible for direct admit consideration. And if they're not, then they're not. Like they're not on the menu for the rest of the faculty to consider. But you know, of the ones that were in this group, then you know, but first of all, they are notified that this is their situation and that they should consider contacting any faculty that they're interested in working with if they haven't already. And secondly, the faculty are notified that we have this group of applications that we consider to be of high quality and that we are not able to offer program interview to. And you might want to take a look at these applications and consider, and we even, you know, map out for the faculty, here are the people who each of these applicants mentioned in their statements to make it a little easier for them. So we try a bit to play matchmaker in that regard. But yeah, that's basically what we do. Uh-huh. Good question. I am not sure. I have heard of programs that only have one track, like they only do rotations. I'm not sure how common it is to have both. There are clearly programs that only do direct admission because they don't have the funding, you know, and that varies a lot by biological subfield. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is really. I'm not sure how many programs have both tracks going on. So we actually do online interviews. We used to do in-person interviews, then the pandemic happened. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic, as awful as it was overall, is that we realized that online interviews were better, at least for us. And you know, there are multiple reasons for that. You know, it can be better in terms of both applicants and faculty to not have to get to the in-person meetings. So less travel for the applicants. You know, for the faculty, even if they are traveling, they could still do interviews. And you know, there are other good things too. Like, I mean, we're in Wisconsin. We used to bring people out here like in mid-January. It wasn't always the greatest impression weather-wise. And so now we bring them out in March, which, you know, is still kind of hit and miss, but on average, maybe somewhat less harsh. So that's a good thing for us. And we also save a ton of money this way, to be honest, you know, versus flying out everyone in North America who we want to interview, and then not accepting some of them. It works out a lot better for us if we're only flying out the ones that we accepted and who still want to visit by March, because by then some of them have ruled us out. So, you know, we end up paying for less flights and less hotel rooms and so forth. It really helps our budget, you know, and having more money for our students. So that's why we do things this way. Our interviews are quite early. So, you know, we're doing interviews like January 9th and 10th. This year, for the first time, we're only doing one interview date, you know, one pair of days. So if somebody wants to interview for us, that's when. I think we are kind of offsetting from other programs to the extent we can. You know, so but in general, you know, that again, this is the very early end. Other programs interviews might be as late as the very beginning of March. So that's kind of interview season. But by you know, like early to mid-March, we're inviting students to come here who have applicants we've already accepted. So in our interviews, there's a whole range of activities. There's no time to talk about that today, but we'll talk about it next week. And that includes 5 meetings with individual faculty or occasionally with another member of their lab instead. But these are faculty generally that the applicant has requested to meet with. And those faculty actually score each person that they interview on the same scale that our applications were reviewed on. You know, that may make you feel nervous and awkward, but I'll tell you next time why you shouldn't be. And they also mentioned to us whether they feel like they could offer that student a rotation, because we want to know, like, does this student have potential homes if we take them? And so what do we do with that information? Well, the admissions committee meets again. And again, we sort the applicants based on their scores, but this time they have both application scores and interview scores. And as an organizational tool for our meetings, we actually sort them initially based on the average of those 2 averages, the average of their application and interview scores. And then we discuss them individually and vote on whether to accept them, again, with strong consideration of how many we're looking for. And if we don't feel like we can offer them program acceptance, then we will tend to have a second vote on whether to add them to our group that is cleared for direct admission. In this case, they've been interviewed already, and so they would just be completely authorized for direct admission if there is an interested faculty member and the applicant wants that. And one thing I want to emphasize at the end here is that, and I'll say this again next week, most people we interview get in. And so I'm going to focus on the domestic side here. But you know, the way that we figure out like how many, you know, to interview is to first figure out like, well, how many do we want in our next class? And then I have a way of going from that number, you know, that number might be, you know, let's say 10. And then I figure out how many we should admit on that basis, you know, and that number might be like 30 plus, because, you know, actually, you know, roughly only about 1/3 or just a little more of the applicants who we accept will actually choose our program. Most of the ones that we accept are getting accepted other places too. They've got options. And so actually, if more than 1/3 are choosing us over however many others accepted them, I actually think we're doing pretty good. You know, this doesn't bother me really. Yeah, so from our target class size, I figure out how many we would like to be accepting, assuming there are that many that meet our standards. And then I usually try to invite for interview 50% more than that. But on average, something like 1/8 of the ones we invite will actually decline our interview because, you know, maybe they got so many interviews, they don't know what to do with them all. Maybe they've already decided, okay, you are not at the top of my list. You know, maybe they have a date conflict and they prefer another program with those same interview dates. So, you know, this is the historical average for what proportion decline our interview. And so if you do the math, you know, and you say, you know, okay, this is like 150%, but I'm going to take 1/8 off of that. Really, we're only ending up interviewing about 1/3 more applicants than we plan to accept. In other words, about 3/4 of the domestic applicants, so, you know, flip over 4/3, 3/4 of the domestic applicants that we interview are likely to be program accepted for rotations in our program. And we might actually send a few of the others to our direct admit authorized group as well. Although there usually are at least a small number who we just do not feel interviewed well. And don't ask me why. We'll talk about that next time. I know I'm a little bit over here. All right, so next time, again, I want to remind you, do not delete the peer review comments. I will let you know when it's okay to delete them. You are free to, you know, to kind of make a new Google Doc from the one that you have. You can make a copy and then do whatever you want to the copy and then submit the link to the copy as your final statement. So if you want to do something now, that's how you do it, but don't mess with your original draft yet, okay? So by next Friday's class, you need to submit a link, and I need to create this assignment, but you need to submit the link to your final draft statement of purpose. I'll be creating this assignment soon because some of you want to turn that in pretty soon for individual reasons. And so, yeah, that can be a new link if that works for you. All right. Yeah. So, and you know, if you turned it in early, you might get feedback sooner. And especially if you have told me or do tell me now that you have application deadlines before December 1st. All right. Thanks.